Spit blood on the deck and it freezes before you can wipe your chin. That's how cold a dying dreadnought gets. The coalition command thought our makeshift fleet was a refugee caravan limping from the slaughter. They didn't realize we were the slaughter. We were the backup. Grease, recycled sweat, and the faint bitter tang of burning wiring. That's what salvation smells like. I sat strapped into the crash seat of a Mark IV drop pod, staring at the rust flaking off the bulkhead opposite my helmet. The structural integrity of the UNS Roanoke was a running joke among the infantry, but nobody was laughing today. We were dropping into the meat grinder. Beside me, Hayes was rhythmically tapping his knuckles against his ceramic knee plating. Tap, tap, tap. It was driving me insane. I didn't say anything. If I opened my mouth, my breakfast, synthetic protein paste that tasted like wet cardboard, was going to make a violent reappearance. "Cut the feed, Wyatt," Jenkins muttered from the corner. His voice was distorted through the static of the squad's comms net. I don't want to hear these coalition bastards crying before we even hit the dirt. Wyatt, our squad's comms tech, just shook her head, tapping the side of her scratched helmet. "Captain's orders. Miller wants everyone on the net to hear the tactical situation. Shut up and listen." The channel hissed. Then came the voice of the Vora fleet commander. It didn't sound like words, not at first. The translation matrix in our helmets converted the frantic melodic chiming into a clipped aristocratic English accent. "Unidentified human vessels, break off your approach. I repeat, break off. You're entering a Class 9 engagement zone. Your hull signatures indicate critical damage and an absence of kinetic shielding. Flee to the outer relay. We require military reinforcements, not civilian scavengers." I barked a laugh, coughing as the dry, stale air of the pod caught in my throat. Civilian scavengers. That was a polite way of describing the Roanoke. To a species like the Vora, elegant towering beings with iridescent skin and warships that looked like polished silver teardrops, our vessel was a flying garbage can. The Roanoke used to haul asteroidal ice near Jupiter before the war. When the draft hit, they slapped a dozen railguns on her hull, painted her grey, and called her a dreadnought. The Vora fought with plasma lances and harmonic energy shields. We fought with whatever we could weld onto a titanium chassis. "Vora command," Captain Miller's voice cut through the channel. She sounded bored. She always sounded bored when people were dying. It was a coping mechanism, or maybe just pure exhaustion. "This is the UNS Roanoke. We are your military reinforcements." A long pause hung on the line. The dull vibration of the Roanoke's main thrusters hummed through the soles of my heavy boots, rattling my teeth. "Captain Miller, your fleet consists of retrofitted mining barges and obsolete freighters," the Vora commander replied, the translator failing to hide the desperate, terrified edge in their chimes. "The crack swarm has already broken our center line on the surface. You cannot help us. Your biology is too fragile for heavy gravity combat. Save your people. Do not throw your refugees into the fire." "Appreciate the concern, Commander," Miller said, her voice flat. "Drop pods launching in 30 seconds. Keep your heads down." The channel went dead. The silence in the pod was heavier than the artificial gravity. "Refugees," Barrett scoffed in the dark, racking the bolt of his heavy kinetic rifle. The loud metallic clack-clack of the action echoed sharply in the cramped space. "Guess we forgot to pack our polished armor, boys." "Just check your seals," I told him, rubbing the bridge of my nose underneath my visor. A dull headache was blooming behind my eyes. I was 34 years old. Too old for orbital combat drops, too young to retire, and too stupid to do anything else. The red light above the pod door clicked on, bathing the cramped interior in a bloody hue. 20 seconds, Wyatt called out, gripping her overhead harness so tight her knuckles turned white through her gloves. My stomach tightened. That familiar cold knot formed right beneath my ribs. It wasn't bravery. Bravery is a word used by politicians who have never smelled a man burning to death. What I felt was grim resignation, a biological imperative to survive, tangled up with the absolute certainty that today might be the day I didn't. The klaxon wailed. 3 short, deafening bursts. The floor dropped out from under us. Gravity ceased to exist for a terrifying second, replaced by the violent, bone-rattling shudder of the magnetic launch rails throwing us out of the ship's belly. The pod plummeted into the atmosphere of Viridia Prime. The friction roared outside the thin titanium hull, a deafening screech of tearing metal and burning oxygen. I clamped my jaw shut, focusing on the tactical display on my HUD. The green altimeter numbers were dropping too fast. The internal temperature of the pod spiked, turning the air into a sauna. Sweat broke out on my forehead, stinging my eyes, dripping down my nose. The inertial dampeners on these old models were shot. I felt every turbulent pocket of air, every violent shift in atmospheric pressure. It felt like being locked inside a steel drum and thrown down a jagged mountain. "Brace!" I yelled, though no one could hear me over the re-entry scream. We hit the ground. The impact didn't just rattle my teeth, it compressed my spine. My vision whited out for a fraction of a second, black spots dancing in the periphery. The retro rockets had fired late. Standard issue garbage. Before the dust could even settle, the explosive bolts on the pod door blew outward with a concussive crack. The heavy metal ramp slammed down into the alien mud. The smell hit me first, punching straight through the helmet's air scrubbers. Ozone, burning polymer, and underneath it all the sharp ammonia tang of Vora blood. I unclipped my harness, my fingers clumsy and numb in the thick tactical gloves, and stumbled out of the pod. My boots sank 3 inches into purple ash-choked soil. The sky above Viridia Prime was bleeding. Heavy cruisers were trading broadsides in low orbit, painting the black clouds with streaks of angry orange and sickly green plasma. But the real nightmare was on the ground. We had dropped straight into a shattered courtyard of what looked like an alien cathedral. Glass-like structures, beautiful and terrifyingly fragile, were pulverized into shimmering dust. Scattered among the ruins were the Vora. They were dying beautifully. I'll give them that. Their silver armor gleamed even in the ash, and they moved with a fluid, liquid grace, like dancers caught in a hurricane. But grace doesn't stop a Crack's butcher blade. A hulking shape crested the ridge of the courtyard ruins, a Crack's warrior. It looked like a walking tank made of dense muscle, scarred grey leather, and crude iron plating. It held a massive kinetic hammer, the head still dripping with glowing blue Vora blood. At the foot of the ridge, a Vora soldier was crawling backward in the mud, one of its forearms cleanly severed at the elbow. The Vora raised a delicate plasma pistol, firing a neat, searing beam at the Cracks. The shot hit the beast square in the chest. It sizzled. The Cracks didn't even flinch. It just roared. A wet, guttural sound that vibrated deep in my chest and raised the hammer to finish the job. I didn't think. I didn't scream a battle cry for the glory of humanity. I just planted my feet, raised my MK4 heavy auto rifle, and pulled the trigger. The MK4 isn't a graceful weapon. It doesn't fire elegant beams of concentrated light. It fires 75 caliber slugs of depleted uranium at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. The recoil punched into my shoulder like a pneumatic press. The noise was apocalyptic. Thud, 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 thud. The rounds slammed into the Cracks. Kinetic energy is a simple, unforgiving physics lesson. The elegant plasma didn't bother the beast, but 1/2 pound of solid lead travelling at Mach 3 will demand anyone's attention. The first round shattered the Cracks' iron chestplate into jagged shrapnel. The second pulverised its thick ribs. The third and fourth took off its lower jaw and left shoulder. The beast was dead before it hit the dirt, dropping with a wet, meaty thud that kicked up a massive cloud of purple ash. The Vora soldier on the ground stopped crawling. Its narrow, multifaceted eyes stared at the mangled, headless corpse of the Cracks, then slowly turned to look at me. I lowered the rifle, the barrel smoking aggressively, the heat radiating right through my gauntlets. I spit a wad of dust and saliva onto the mud. My shoulder ached like a bastard. "Move up!" I barked over the external speakers. my voice rough and distorted by the cheap microphone. Barrett, secure that ridge. Hayes, cover the flanks. Jenkins, get this shiny bastard on his feet. My squad fanned out from the pod. Our heavy, scarred power armor moved with a loud mechanical clunking. There was nothing elegant about us. Our armor was bulky, painted in drab olive and scratched charcoal, held together by ugly weld lines and field repairs. We looked like industrial machinery that had grown legs and picked up guns. More cracks were cresting the ruins. 10 of them, then 20. They saw us. They saw the small group of muddy, battered bipeds standing between them and the broken Vora line, and they charged. Contact, Barrett said dryly over the net. He didn't sound scared. He sounded incredibly annoyed. He dropped to one heavy knee, bracing his squad automatic weapon on a chunk of fallen crystal. The air tore apart. The Vora fought with precision, trying to hit vital organs. We fought with volume. Barrett opened up, laying down a suppressing fire that chewed the top of the crystal ridge into flying shrapnel. Crack's warriors were ripped to pieces, their momentum carrying their shredded bodies forward until they piled up in a grotesque mound of meat and iron in the mud. I moved to the left, taking cover behind a shattered pillar. The Cracks weren't stupid. They had guns too, heavy slug throwers that fired rusted, foot-long spikes. One of them clipped my right pauldron. The kinetic force was staggering, spinning me around and dropping me face first into the dirt. "Son of a bitch," I hissed, tasting fresh blood where I bit the inside of my cheek. I scrambled back to my knees, wiping a smear of mud off my cracked visor. A Cracks leaped over Barrett's suppression line, landing heavy just 10 feet away from Hayes. Hayes panicked. He was young, only 2 orbital drops under his belt. He froze, his finger locking up stiff on the trigger guard, his eyes wide behind his faceplate. The Cracks swung a jagged broadsword. "Hayes, move!" I screamed, lunging forward, my boots slipping in the mud. I didn't make it in time. The blade sheared through Hayes' chestplate like wet paper. Hayes let out a gurgling shriek, falling backward into the dirt, clutching his ruined chest as the suit's atmospheric seals hissed and died. The Cracks raised the blade to finish it. I hit the beast at a dead sprint. My armor weighed 400 pounds, moving at 15 miles an hour. I slammed my shoulder directly into the Cracks' knee joint. The joint snapped backward with a sound like a falling tree. The beast roared, toppling awkwardly and dropping the sword. It lashed out blindly, a massive leathery hand wrapping around my helmet. The servos in my neck screamed as the beast tried to crush my skull. The pressure was immense. I heard the composite glass of my visor begin to splinter. The smell of the creature's breath washed over me through the cracks, a foul stench of rotten meat and sulphur. I didn't try to pry its hand off. I just shoved the muzzle of my rifle directly up under its chin plate and held down the trigger until the magazine clicked empty. The Cracks' head practically ceased to exist in a spray of dark blood and bone fragments. The heavy grip released me. I fell back, gasping for air, my lungs burning. I dropped the empty mag, slapping a fresh one into the receiver with a frantic metallic clatter. I turned to Hayes. He was writhing, coughing up pink froth inside his helmet. The armor's medical suite was already flooding his system with coagulants, stimulants, and painkillers, but the wound was deep. "Wyatt, get over here! Hayes is bleeding out!" I shouted, grabbing Hayes by the collar plate and dragging his heavy suit behind the pillar. The Vora soldier from earlier had dragged itself over, leaning against the ruins. It watched me, its delicate 3-fingered hand hovering over Hayes' bubbling chest wound. It looked horrified, not by the Cracks' brutality, by us. Your biology," the Vora's translator chirped in my ear, the synthetic voice trembling. "You took a kinetic strike to your cranial plating. Your comrade's chest cavity is compromised. You should be in systemic shock. You should be dead." I looked at the alien, then down at my own hands. My knuckles were shaking violently. My pulse was hammering in my ears so loud I could barely hear Barrett's machine gun chewing through the remaining cracks. I was terrified. My shoulder felt dislocated and my jaw was bruised. I just didn't have the luxury of stopping. "Yeah, well," I grunted, pulling a heavy pneumatic med stapler from my thigh pouch and pressing it hard into Hayes' open armour. Hayes screamed, a raw, ugly sound, as the thick staples bit into his flesh and sealed the gap. "We're stubborn like that." I stood up, the servos in my knees whining loudly in protest. The Cracks' charge was faltering. For the first time in their planetary campaign of butchery, they had hit a wall made of mud, cheap titanium, and pure spite. We weren't the graceful, enlightened saviours the Coalition wanted, but we were exactly the monsters they needed. Ash-coated everything. It turned the olive-drab plating of my armour a sickly bruised violet. I spat a mixture of saliva and grit into the helmet's waste recycler, the metallic taste of adrenaline and old copper lingering on my tongue. "Status," I rasped over the local net. My throat felt like it had been scrubbed with wire wool. "Weapons overheating," Barrett grunted. He was kneeling behind a shattered crystal barricade, slapping a fresh cooling cell into his heavy automatic rifle. The barrel of his gun glowed a dull, angry cherry red, radiating waves of heat that distorted the air around him. Got maybe 200 rounds left before I have to resort to the sidearm. After that, I'm throwing rocks. "Hayes is stable, but he's out of the fight," Wyatt chimed in. She had her shoulder wedged under Hayes' uninjured arm, practically dragging his 400-pound bulk. The medical foam had expanded out of the jagged tear in his chest plate, hardening into a rigid, ugly white scab. His breathing was ragged, audible over the comms as a wet, rhythmic wheeze. "Jenkins?" I asked. "Still breathing, boss," Jenkins muttered. He was reloading his shotgun, his thick, clumsy fingers shoving thick shells into the underbarrel tube. Shuck, clack, shuck, clack. The mechanical rhythm was strangely comforting. Wish I could say the same for the locals. I turned my heavy helmet toward the Vora defensive line. It was a butcher's yard. The Cracks hadn't just broken their flank. They had driven a wedge straight through the heart of the alien compound. The delicate, towering spires of the Vora architecture, structures that looked like spun glass and silver wire, were collapsing under the barrage of Cracks mortar fire. The ground shook violently, the kinetic impacts travelling up through the soles of my boots and rattling the teeth in my skull. The Vora soldier we'd saved was still standing near us, leaning heavily against a fractured pillar. It was clutching a specialised plasma rifle, though its hands, fragile, long-fingered things, were trembling so hard I doubted it could hit the broadside of a dropship. "Human," the alien's translator buzzed in my ear. "Your forces, they're advancing. Why are they advancing? The tactical algorithm dictates an immediate fallback to the inner sanctum. The line is lost." I pulled my primary rifle up, checking the ammunition counter glowing faintly in the corner of my cracked HUD. 32 rounds. 4 spare magazines on my chest rig. "Because we don't have an inner sanctum to hide in," I told it, wiping a thick smear of mud and Cracks blood off my visor. "And we sure as hell don't retreat. My ship up there? The Roanoke? She barely had enough fuel to jump into this system. We don't have the juice to jump out. We hold this dirt or we die on it." The alien stared at me, its multifaceted eyes reflecting the dull red emergency lights blinking on my chest plate. It couldn't comprehend us. To the Vora, war was a mathematical equation, a cold, calculated exchange of energy and positioning. You fight until the odds drop below 30% and then you concede. To us, war was an industrial accident that we just kept surviving. "Squad 7, sitrep." Captain Miller's voice crackled through the static, completely devoid of inflection. "We're knee-deep in mud and ugly, Captain," I replied, rolling my aching shoulder. The joint popped loudly. Secured the western courtyard. Hayes took a hit to the chest. Armour compromised, but the foam caught the bleeding. "We're holding the flank, but the main Vora line is buckling hard." "Copy that, 7. Command requires a wedge. The Cracks are funneling their heavy armour through the central causeway. If they breach the doors of the primary relay, the Vora planetary shield drops. If the shield drops, the Cracks fleet turns this continent to glass." "Understood. Orders?" "Plug the hole, Carter. Push to the causeway. I'm moving the Roanoke into low orbit to provide danger close fire support. You have 10 minutes before I start dropping tungsten telephone poles on that courtyard. Do not be there when I do." The line went dead. I let out a slow, heavy breath. The air inside the suit smelled like sour sweat and ozone. 10 minutes to push through a sea of 9-foot-tall meat tanks. "You heard the captain," I said, switching to the squad frequency. "We're moving to the causeway. Wyatt, find a ditch for Hayes. Give him a sidearm and leave him. We need your rifle." "Copy," Wyatt said tightly. She didn't argue. She just dragged Hayes behind a dense pile of rubble, pressed a heavy pistol into his good hand and jogged back to us, her boots sucking loudly in the purple mud. "Jenkins, take point. Barrett, keep that heavy gun singing. Let's go introduce ourselves." We moved. We didn't sprint. Sprinting in power armor is a good way to blow a knee servo and end up face down in the dirt. We marched. A slow, heavy, relentless stomp that chewed up the alien soil. The cracks heard us coming. How could they not? We were loud, clunky, and utterly devoid of stealth. A squad of cracks warriors broke off from the main assault, turning their heavy slug throwers toward us. Thwack! 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 Thick, iron spikes hammered into the ruins around us, shattering the crystalline walls into razor-sharp shrapnel. One spike skipped off Jenkins's chest plate, gouging a deep silver trench in the olive paint and throwing him back a step. He didn't fall. He just grunted, leveled his shotgun, and fired. At close range, a heavy buckshot shell from an MK8 doesn't just penetrate, it liquefies. The lead cracks folded in half. Its chest cavity turned to red mist. "Keep moving!" I yelled over the deafening roar of the guns. I snapped my rifle up, firing in short, controlled bursts. Pop, pop, pop. A cracks dropped, grabbing its ruined throat. Pop, pop, pop. Another went down, its knee joint shattered. We didn't dodge. We didn't leap. We just waded into the fire, trusting the ugly, heavy titanium plates of our scavenged armor to take the hits. I felt the brutal impacts of grazing shots, jarring shocks that rattled my teeth and left deep bruises under my undersuit. The internal temperature of my armor spiked to 110 degrees. Sweat ran into my eyes, burning like acid. I blinked it away, keeping my finger on the trigger. The Vora watched us from the ruins. They'd stopped firing. They were just watching, paralyzed by the sheer primitive brutality of our advance. We were a blunt instrument in a war of lasers. We were the wrench thrown into the gears. Smoke thick enough to chew rolled over the central causeway. We hit the main gap in the Vora defensive line just as the Crack's vanguard breached it. The causeway was a massive sweeping bridge of polished silver metal, leading directly to the planetary relay doors, and it was choking with cracks. There were hundreds of them. A tidal wave of grey leather, iron plating, and roaring muscle. Behind us, the remaining Vora defenders had retreated to the relay doors. Their commander, a towering figure in gilded silver armor, was barking frantic, musical orders, trying to establish a firing line. But their weapons were depleted. Their elegant shields were flickering and dying. "Line up," I roared, my voice cracking. The four of us formed a horizontal line across the throat of the causeway, 4 battered, smoking suits of scavenged armor against a horde. "Barrett, let it eat!" Barrett didn't say a word. He just planted his boots, braced his heavy weapon against his hip, and held the trigger down. A solid stream of depleted uranium tore into the front ranks of the cracks. The noise was absolute. It felt like standing next to a jet engine. The front line of the crack swarm dissolved, but they just kept coming, climbing over the shredded bodies of their dead, their boots slipping in the slick blue blood. "Wyatt! Jenkins! Overlapping fields!" I shouted, firing my own rifle until the barrel smoked and the thermal warning screamed in my HUD. We stood there and absorbed the punishment. A heavy iron slug took Wyatt in the shoulder, spinning her around. She caught herself on one knee, switched her rifle to her left hand and kept firing. A chunk of shrapnel tore through the soft joint behind Jenkins' knee. He roared, dropping to the deck, firing his shotgun upward into the belly of a leaping cracks. My rifle clicked dry. I didn't bother reloading. There wasn't time. A Crax warrior, massive and scarred, broke through Barrett's suppression fire and barreled toward me, raising a jagged, rusted halberd. I dropped the rifle, drew my heavy tungsten combat knife, and stepped inside the swing. The halberd cleaved the air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I drove the knife upward, bypassing the iron chest plate and sliding the 8-inch blade directly into the soft, unarmoured flesh beneath the creature's jaw. The Crax choked, dropping the weapon. Thick, foul-smelling blood sprayed across my visor, blinding me. I kicked the dying beast away, wiping the blood off my faceplate with a clumsy armoured forearm. I was gasping for air. My lungs burned. Every muscle in my body was screaming in protest, flooded with lactic acid and the sheer exhausting weight of the armour. "Captain," I gasped into the comms, my voice a ragged wheeze. "We can't hold them. There's too many." "You don't have to, Carter. Look up." I tilted my head back. Breaking through the bloody ash-choked clouds of Viridia Prime was the UNS Roanoke. She was an ugly ship, a massive brutalist wedge of grey metal, scarred by micrometeorites and hastily welded armour plating. She wasn't elegant, but as the belly of the ship glowed with the blinding, terrible light of building kinetic energy, she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Danger close!" I screamed over the local net. "Brace for impact." We threw ourselves flat against the silver deck of the causeway. The Roanoke fired. There was no sound. Not at first. Just a brilliant, searing flash of white light that turned the purple sky to midday sun. Then the shockwave hit. 3 20-ton tungsten rods dropped from low orbit struck the center of the Crax swarm. The kinetic impact was equivalent to a tactical nuclear warhead, minus the radiation. The sound didn't register in my ears. It registered in my bones. It felt like the planet itself had been struck by a hammer. The shockwave picked me up and threw me backward. I skidded across the silver deck, my armour sparking and groaning, before slamming hard into a crystal barricade. My vision went completely black. I don't know how long I was out. When my vision slowly returned, the world was tinted yellow by my HUD's emergency backup power. A persistent, high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears. I groaned, pushing myself up. My left arm wouldn't respond. The shoulder servo was completely fused, and the arm hung dead at my side. I dragged myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the barricade. The causeway was gone. In its place was a massive, smoking crater. The Crax swarm had been vaporized. Nothing remained but drifting ash, and the smell of utterly scorched earth. I looked around. Barrett was sitting on the ground, leaning back against his steaming gun, laughing softly to himself. It sounded like the laugh of a madman. Wyatt was kneeling next to Jenkins, taping up his bleeding leg with a roll of heavy industrial flex tape. They were alive, battered, broken, and bleeding, but alive. Footsteps approached. Slow, delicate footsteps. I turned. The Vora commander was walking toward us, flanked by its surviving honor guard. Their armor was pristine, their weapons gleaming. They stopped 10 feet away, staring at us. We looked like garbage. My armor was scorched black, covered in mud and gore. My visor was spiderwebbed with cracks. I was slouched, breathing heavily, holding my useless left arm. The Vora commander looked at the massive smoking crater, then looked back at me. It reached up with its delicate, long-fingered hands and slowly removed its ornate helmet. The alien's face was pale, its eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. "You," the commander's voice translated, soft and trembling, "your species. Your command ships are mining barges. Your armor is welded scrap. You lack kinetic shielding. You bleed. You break." I spat another wad of bloody grit onto the pristine silver floor, letting out an exhausted, cynical breath. "Yeah," I rasped, glaring at the alien through my cracked visor. "We do." "Then how?" the commander whispered, stepping forward, as if studying a terrifying new species. "How did you survive? How did you hold the line?" I reached up, unsealing my damaged helmet with a hiss of releasing pressure. I pulled it off, tossing it onto the deck. The cold, ash-filled air hit my sweaty, bruised face. I looked the alien dead in the eye. "Because you assumed we needed reinforcements," I told him, my voice flat, dead, and entirely human. "We didn't. We just needed a target. Thank you for listening to this sci-fi drama. If humanity's stubborn survival in the face of impossible odds resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with fellow sci-fi fans. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest, most thrilling corners of the galaxy. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay gritty, and we'll see you in the next drop.